Who the hell leaves a crate in the middle of a highway? Officer Jonah Reeves slammed his palm against the steering wheel, bringing his patrol car to a screeching halt just inches from the rusted cage. He threw the door open before the engine had even finished humming, his boots crunching on the sun-baked asphalt as he jogged toward the crate, rage already simmering in his gut. At first, he thought it was empty, just another piece of roadside trash. But then, he heard it, a whimper, fragile, broken, and steady like someone crying quietly into their hands. He dropped to his knees, squinting through the grime-caked metal bars. A puppy, a German shepherd, pup, no older than a few months, curled tightly into the corner of the cage. His body trembled with every breath, his eyes wide but alert. Jonah's heart clenched. But then something strange caught his attention. The pup wasn't curled up just for comfort. He was shielding something with his tiny frame, something wrapped in an old tattered towel soaked with sweat and blood. Jonah's voice softened. "Hey, buddy, what are you hiding?" He reached out slowly, expecting the dog to recoil, maybe snap out of fear. But the puppy didn't move. He just stared, not at Jonah, but past him, like he was still expecting the person who left him to come back. Jonah unlatched the crate, gently pulling the towel away, and that's when he froze. Inside the bundle was a newborn baby, barely breathing, face flushed red from heat stroke. A sticky hospital bracelet still clung to its tiny wrist, and its cries, weak as they were, pierced Jonah's chest like a blade. His hands moved faster than his thoughts. He grabbed the radio clipped to his chest. "Dispatch, this is Unit 17. I need an ambulance on Highway 49 near mile marker 213. Infant found abandoned, barely breathing. And send animal control, but tell them the dog stays with me." The radio crackled, but Jonah didn't wait. He ripped his jacket off and cradled the infant inside it, glancing back at the pup, who was now trying to drag himself closer to Jonah, legs wobbling like they could barely hold his weight. "You little hero," Jonah whispered, eyes burning. "You didn't leave him, did you?" In the minutes that followed, traffic backed up in both directions. Horns honked. People slowed down, heads out of windows, trying to understand what was going on, but no one could explain it. A puppy, a baby, a rusted crate in the middle of a highway. When the ambulance arrived, Jonah refused to let them take the baby without the dog. "He stays," he said firmly. He guarded that child like his own. The paramedics exchanged confused glances, but something in Jonah's tone silenced all protest. Later that night, in the flickering lights of St. Anne's Medical Center, the story began to unfold. The hospital bracelet was traced to a young woman who had given birth 2 days earlier. No ID, no address, just a false name and vanishing footprints. Security footage showed her slipping out the back exit, the baby in her arms. Authorities were still piecing together what happened in the hours that followed. But one thing was clear. Someone had abandoned both the child and the dog, leaving them to die under the brutal summer sun. But they hadn't died, because that tiny puppy, weak and half-starved, had curled himself around a stranger's baby and refused to move, even when cars thundered by just feet away. He had barked when anyone got too close, growled at the heat, and stayed awake through the endless, deafening roar of the highway. And now, because of him, that baby was alive. That night, as the nurses wheeled the child into recovery and Jonah sat on a bench outside with the pup resting in his lap, the weight of it all finally hit him. He looked down into those tired, soulful eyes and whispered, "I don't know what your name is, but you saved a life today, and I swear you'll never be abandoned again." The hospital room was silent, except for the faint beeping of machines and the soft breathing of the newborn, swaddled in a fresh blanket. Officer Jonah Reeves stood just outside the nursery window, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes locked on the tiny infant whose life had been saved in the most unimaginable way. The German shepherd puppy sat beside him, cleaner now after a gentle bath, but still visibly shaken, his ears twitching at every passing sound. The doctors had confirmed what Jonah feared. The baby had been hours away from dehydration and organ failure. If they had arrived any later, the outcome would have been very different. And yet, the pup had somehow kept the child warm enough, shaded enough, and safe enough to survive. It was nothing short of a miracle. Nurse Claire stepped beside Jonah, holding a clipboard. "They're going to keep the baby under observation for at least 48 hours. No sign of infection, just extreme fatigue, but he's responding well." Jonah nodded, still staring at the glass. "And the dog? Vet says he's underweight, dehydrated. and might have an old injury on his back leg. But it's not life-threatening. He'll make a full recovery. He finally turned to her. Did we get any leads on the mother? Claire frowned. No name, no fingerprints in the system, and she used a burner phone to check into the hospital. Whoever she is, she didn't want to be found, Jonas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I've seen a lot in my years, Claire, but never a dog guarding a baby like that. Not like this. Claire gave a sad smile. Maybe he knew what abandonment felt like. That line hit harder than Jonah expected. He watched as the pup slowly laid his head on the floor, eyes still trained on the nursery window, like he couldn't relax unless he saw the baby breathing. A low, nearly inaudible whine escaped his throat whenever a nurse entered the room, as if he was asking for permission to be by the baby's side again. Later that evening, the sun dipped below the horizon and the ward grew quiet. Jonah sat on a bench outside with the pup curled beside him. He had named him Rusty, partly because of the cage he'd been found in, and partly because of the reddish hue in his otherwise ash-colored fur. A sharp knock on the precinct office door the next morning interrupted Jonah's coffee. It was Detective Miriam Walsh, sleeves rolled up, hair tied in a messy bun, carrying a file that looked far too thin to be promising. We might have something, she said, dropping the folder. On his desk, Jonah flipped it open. Inside were blurry images from nearby traffic cams. A sedan slowing near the shoulder around 3:12 a.m., the faint outline of a person stepping out with what looked like a small crate. No plates? Covered. We're checking surrounding businesses to see if anyone had outside cameras facing the road. Jonah frowned. Why the crate? Why the dog and the baby together? Miriam shrugged. Maybe she thought someone would stop faster for a dog. Or maybe the dog was the only protection she could leave the baby with. Jonah closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting to the sleeping pup curled under the desk. Well, whatever her reasons, she left them both to die. That afternoon, Jonah did something he hadn't planned. He took Rusty to a nearby foster home, not for people, but for working dogs. The place, run by a former K-9 handler named Travis Holt, specialized in rehabilitating abandoned or mistreated dogs and giving them structure again. As soon as Rusty stepped onto the grounds, his ears perked up. He sniffed the air, watched the other dogs train, and even wagged his tail. Barely, but it was there. He's got fire in him, Travis observed after a few minutes. You can see it in the way he watches. He's alert, smart, probably been through hell. Jonah nodded. Think he could be trained? Travis smiled. If he trusts again, yeah. This one could be something special. But that trust didn't come easily. For days, Rusty remained hesitant, flinching at sudden sounds and barking wildly at anything unfamiliar. He ate in silence, slept in corners, and refused to interact with other dogs. But every time someone showed him kindness, like a treat, a soft command, or just a hand held still near his snout, he moved a little closer, as if testing whether this time it was safe. Meanwhile, the baby, now named Elijah by the nurses, was recovering quickly. Social services had begun searching for a suitable foster family. Jonah visited every day, bringing Rusty once a week, each time standing a little closer to the crib. And though Rusty never made a sound during those visits, he always looked at the baby with the same quiet intensity, as if silently checking that Elijah was still alive. Then came the day that changed everything. During a routine training drill, one of Travis's dogs panicked near the road and slipped free. Rusty, watching from a distance, suddenly bolted, not in fear but with intent. He reached the dog, barked twice, then positioned himself between the road and his companion, head, low body tense. Travis blew his whistle, and to everyone's surprise, Rusty backed away, slowly, but obediently, controlled, focused. Jonah, watching from the sidelines, didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he whispered, "He's ready." Back at the hospital, as Jonah carried Rusty in to visit Elijah one final time before the baby's transfer to a foster family, the nurse smiled. "He hasn't cried all morning, until you two walked in." Jonah approached the crib, Rusty trotting alongside him, tail wagging gently. As they reached the side, Elijah stirred, then giggled. A small hand reached out, clumsy, uncertain, and landed right on Rusty's head. Rusty didn't flinch. He leaned in, just enough to let the baby's fingers tangle in his fur, and in that quiet moment, no sirens, no panic, no heat waves or headlines, Jonah knew. These two had survived something together, something most people wouldn't understand, but they did, and somehow that was enough. Under the soft hum of the hospital's nighttime quiet, something had shifted, both in the hallway and inside Jonah's chest. He'd seen the worst in people, witnessed cruelty that left even hardened officers speechless. But what this tiny puppy had done, guarding a fragile baby on a dark highway in a broken crate, was unlike anything he could explain with logic or training. It was pure, raw devotion, and that same loyalty was now forming a silent tether between Jonah and the dog. Rusty had finally stopped trembling. He sat beside Jonah's feet, tail gently brushing the floor, eyes occasionally glancing toward the nursery door as if counting the seconds until he could check on Elijah again. Every nurse, every passing patient gave the pup a wide berth, not out of fear, but respect. Somehow everyone seemed to understand. This dog had earned his place. The baby's condition continued to stabilize, and while the hospital worked on placing Elijah into emergency foster care, Jonah found himself dragging his feet. He visited the hospital on his days off, brought treats for Rusty, and sat quietly beside the incubator even when there was nothing new to report. He didn't know why. Maybe it was guilt, maybe admiration, but it was becoming personal. Then one morning, everything changed. Travis Holt, the former K-9 handler who had taken Rusty into his rehabilitation facility, called Jonah with a strained voice. "He's missing," Travis said flatly. "I stepped out to lock the outer gate, came back, and he was gone. No broken fences, just gone." Jonah felt a chill crawl up his back. "How long?" 30 minutes, tops, but we're near the woods. If he ran, he didn't run," Jonah interrupted. "He's not running from anything, he's going. Somewhere. And deep down, Jonah already knew where." 27 minutes later, he burst through the hospital's side entrance, breath heavy, badge swinging on his chest. Nurses turned to stare, startled. Before anyone could speak, he ran toward the maternity wing. At the far end of the hallway, just outside Elijah's door, Rusty was sitting, calm, still, eyes locked on the glass window. The child had developed a minor fever overnight, nothing serious, but enough to spark concern. A nurse had just stepped in with a cold cloth when Rusty showed up. No barking, no howling, just presence. He had walked through the sliding entrance like he belonged there, navigated the corridors with uncanny certainty, and waited. Jonah knelt beside him, heart pounding in his throat. "How did you find him?" he whispered, voice shaking. Rusty didn't flinch. Jonah ran his hand along the pup's back, feeling the heat of exertion under his coat. "You walked all the way from the rehab center, didn't you? Miles, through traffic, just to check on him." Inside the room, Elijah stirred in his crib, eyes fluttering open. The nurse gasped. "His fever's breaking." That moment felt too poetic to be coincidence. The timing, the instinct. Jonah stood frozen, heart caught between awe and disbelief. He had spent years trying to make sense of the world through police reports, investigations, and witness statements. But this was something else entirely. Rusty turned his gaze up to him, almost as if waiting for permission. "Go ahead," Jonah muttered. "He's yours too." The door opened, and Rusty walked in gently, stepping with care, his gaze fixed on the baby. He sat down beside the crib, resting his head against the edge, and let out a quiet huff. Elijah reached out in his sleep, tiny, fingers brushing the fur near his snout. The nurse, nearly in tears, looked up at Jonah. "Are you seeing this?" "Yeah," Jonah said quietly. "I'm seeing it." But what came next shook everyone. A woman walked into the hospital lobby, barefoot, with dried blood on her sleeve, and a bruised arm cradled against her chest. Her eyes were hollow, movements unsure, like someone who hadn't slept in days. She didn't speak, just stood near the receptionist desk, holding a torn photo, half of a baby's face, half of a German shepherd pup. It didn't take long before security called Jonah. He met her in the visitor's lounge, unsure of what to expect. Her name was Camille Reyes, 23 years old. She'd been in hiding after fleeing an abusive partner who had threatened to kill her and their child. She hadn't meant to abandon Elijah, or the dog. She thought someone would find them quicker if she wasn't there. "I knew Rusty wouldn't." "Leave him," she whispered, her hands trembling as she showed him the photo. They were born the same week. Rusty used to sleep under the crib. Jonah sat quietly, watching as her eyes filled with regret and exhaustion. "You could have come to the police." "I tried, twice. He found me both times. I thought, maybe if I gave them a chance, someone better would protect them." Jonah sighed. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to say she'd made a terrible mistake. But as he looked at her, fragile, terrified, and barely holding herself together, He saw the face of a mother who had run out of options. Hours later, Child Services made a decision. Camille would undergo evaluation, attend counseling, and prove her stability before any reunification with her son. But she was alive. She had come back. And that meant Elijah still had a mother who cared. Jonah stood outside the nursery one last time that evening. Rusty sat beside the crib, his tail swaying slowly. Elijah, now officially named in the hospital, records, cooed softly, his little hand resting against the glass. And in that moment, Jonah realized something. Maybe Rusty wasn't just protecting a baby. Maybe he was giving everyone around him a second chance. The hospital had never felt so alive, yet so tense. Word of Rusty's instinctive arrival, followed by Elijah's miraculous fever break, had quietly made its way through the maternity wing like wildfire. Nurses who usually shuffled past with tired smiles now paused, placing gentle hands over their hearts as they glanced at the baby's room. Doctors who normally kept to their rounds stood a little longer, as if trying to make sense of something science had no chart for. Jonah, though trained in fact over feeling, sat quietly on a bench just outside, replaying everything. Rusty was no longer just a stray. He was no longer a discarded dog in a crate on a highway. He had become something else entirely, a guardian. The kind stories are written about, the kind people don't believe until they see it with their own eyes. And Jonah had. He saw how the pup refused to budge from the glass window, how he didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't whimper, only waited. Something deeper than loyalty was at play, something older. By evening, Camille Reyes was still being evaluated in a private room, but she'd asked one thing through the nurse, just one. She wanted to see her son, not hold him, not take him, just see him. And she had one request. Rusty had to be there too. Jonah wasn't sure why he agreed. Maybe it was the haunted way she had walked in earlier, clutching that torn photo like a lifeline. Maybe it was the way Elijah reached for Rusty in his sleep. Maybe it was the way Rusty had come back, not for safety, but for that baby. Whatever it was, it tugged at something in him he hadn't felt in years. The hospital arranged a quiet meeting room. No lights overhead, just a soft floor lamp and a rocking chair beside a glass bassinet. Camille was wheeled in slowly. Her arms were still bruised. Her left hand trembled as it reached out, hesitated, and then stopped just short of the bassinet. She stared at Elijah, her mouth silently shaping his name. Rusty padded in behind her, sniffed the air once, and then gently stepped forward, placing himself right beside the rocking chair. He looked up at her. For the first time, Camille didn't look afraid, not of Rusty, not of herself. She slowly leaned down and placed her hand on his head. No one moved. Jonah stayed in the hallway, watching through the glass. He saw the tears spill from her eyes, saw her press her forehead to the baby's chest without picking him up, saw her whisper something only Rusty could hear. The dog stayed still. Only his tail thumped once. It was quiet, and it was enough. That night, as Jonah sat in his car, Rusty curled up in the passenger seat beside him, a realization began to take hold. He hadn't just watched a mother come back. He hadn't just seen a dog defy logic to protect a child. He had witnessed something pure, something unfiltered by duty or protocol. The next morning, the hospital social worker pulled him aside. Camille's story checks out. Her injuries, her disappearance. She really was running. She did leave the child and the dog on the highway, yes, but in a place she hoped someone would find them. She had called the emergency tip line that same night, from a blocked number. We found the recording. Jonah stood silent, jaw tight. And now? She's entering a recovery shelter. Supervised visitation with the baby is the next step, but the woman paused. There's a petition being filed about the dog. He narrowed his eyes. What kind of petition? To classify Rusty as a certified emotional support animal for Elijah. That hit Jonah harder than he expected. It made sense. The way the pup protected him. The bond already forming between them. Jonah nodded slowly. What about his ownership? That's what's complicated, the social worker replied. Technically, no one has claimed him. No microchip. No adoption records. You've been listed as the temporary guardian. Jonah looked through the window toward the recovery unit. Rusty was lying under Elijah's crib again, head resting on his paws, eyes closed but ears alert. I don't need paperwork, he muttered. He's already made his choice. That evening, Camille had one final meeting with Jonah before being transferred to her shelter. She didn't ask for anything. Instead, she offered something unexpected. You should keep Rusty, she said, softly. Not because I don't want him, but because I think he was waiting for someone like you. Someone who can protect them both. Jonah opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He simply nodded, emotions choking his throat. Outside, the sun dipped low behind the city skyline. Inside, the hospital lights glowed soft and golden. Rusty lifted his head, sensing movement, and let out a quiet huff as Jonah entered the room. Once more. He walked over, knelt beside the pup, and ran his hand gently over his back. Elijah gurgled from his crib. Rusty responded with a low, comforting whine. It was more than a rescue. It was the beginning of a family no one saw coming, and it all started with a forgotten crate on a dark highway, and a dog who refused to walk away. Jonah hadn't expected the courtroom to feel so suffocating. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, as if trying to fill the silence, but they couldn't drown out the tension pressing on everyone's chest. In the middle of the room sat Camille Reyes, hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes focused on nothing in particular. Just to her right, in a quiet corner near the exit, Rusty lay curled beside Elijah's stroller. The dog hadn't moved since they arrived, only occasionally lifting his head when the baby cooed. This wasn't a trial. Not officially. It was a custody hearing, one that had drawn more attention than anyone expected. News had gotten out about the dog who saved a child and the mother who vanished into the shadows, only to return years later. People had opinions. Some thought Camille didn't deserve a second chance. Others said redemption couldn't be measured in time served or scars healed. Jonah had stayed silent through it all. When his name was called, he stepped forward. Every footstep echoed louder than the last. The judge, a calm woman with tired eyes and a voice that didn't betray any emotion, gestured for him to speak. Jonah didn't read from a paper. He didn't need notes. I was the one who found the crate, he began. Middle of a highway, half crushed. I thought someone had dumped garbage. But it wasn't garbage. It was a puppy, barely alive, bleeding, refusing to let go of the bundle he was guarding. That bundle was Elijah. A murmur rippled through the gallery. I carried them both to the truck. The pup didn't fight me, but he didn't stop watching. Me either. That look in his eyes. It wasn't fear. It was a question, a demand. Like he was asking, will you protect him now? He paused, glancing over at Rusty, who now had one paw draped over the stroller's leg. And since then, that dog has stayed by Elijah's side through everything. Through surgeries, through crying fits, through nights when the nurses couldn't calm him. I've worked with animals my whole life. I've never seen a bond like this one. He turned slightly, facing Camille. I know what it's like to lose your way. I know what it's like to think you're doing the right thing when the world tells you it's wrong. Camille made a choice that night. Not a perfect one, not the safest, but a desperate one. And she spent 5 years paying for that moment. But she didn't disappear to forget. She disappeared to survive. And I think she came back because she never stopped being his mother. He stepped back, heart pounding. The judge said nothing at first. Then she asked the question everyone was waiting for. What do you believe is in the best interest of the child? Jonah hesitated, then looked again at Rusty, then at Elijah's quiet, sleeping face. That he stays with the only family he's known, but not without knowing where he came from. The final decision came an hour later. Camille would be granted supervised weekly visits for 6 months, followed by a re-evaluation. Elijah would remain under Jonah's guardianship, jointly registered with Camille as biological mother. Rusty? The court had no say in that, but everyone knew the answer. 3 months passed. Summer turned the hospital gardens lush and green, and Elijah had begun crawling. He'd pull himself across blankets, chasing after squeaky toys, sometimes abandoning them entirely just to collapse next to Rusty. The pup, now fully grown but gentle as ever, never left the boy's side. Their favorite spot was beneath the big oak tree out back, where birds chirped overhead and dandelions dotted the grass. Camille kept her promise. Every visit she came prepared. Books, baby food, stories, laughter. She never once tried to overstep. And Jonah began to see something unexpected. He saw healing, not just in her, but in all of them. One warm Sunday afternoon, as they sat in the backyard, Camille turned to Jonah and said, "You gave me something no one else ever did. Time to become the mother he deserves." Jonah looked at her, then at Elijah, who was now giggling as Rusty nudged a stuffed bear toward him. "No," he said quietly. "He gave us that, and he meant it." Rusty, once a nameless pup abandoned on the roadside, had become the thread that stitched 3 broken people together. Not through words, not through duty, but through love, fierce, relentless, unshakable. That night, Jonah stood by Elijah's crib, watching as the boy slept with one hand curled around Rusty's ear. He thought about fate, about choices, about how something as simple as a crate on a highway could change the course of so many lives. And he realized something. Sometimes heroes don't come with badges or medals. Sometimes they come with muddy paws, a stitched-up ear, and a heart big enough to carry more than pain. They carry hope, and Rusty had carried it all the way home.